So we're about halfway through the day, and I guess the first thing to say is just like a big welcome to the panel, and also please do whatever you need to make yourself comfortable in your seats, or come and go if you need to. It might be that some of the conversations we have today do touch on some really heavy, distressing stuff, so please don't feel like just because you're halfway on a aisle you can't just get up and move around or leave the room. Feel free to do that. So this panel is about masculinities, current expressions and needs of young men and boys, and how that is looking in schools. So I quite often think of schools as kind of microcosms of the wider society, and I guess part of what we're seeing in schools at the moment is a lot of quite extreme behaviours and extreme language in terms of misogyny, which is also a kind of reflection of some changes happening in the bigger picture. It's also, as we know, well, I guess it's worth saying that we've called it Masculinities plural, and that's trying to just acknowledge the fact that, of course, there is a huge diversity of ways to be a man, to be a boy, to express masculinity, and of course intersectionality is part of that. We all have lots of parts of our identity. But at the same time, it is a really specific time in the history of the world, in the history of technology, around the kind of influences which are around all of us, and which are particularly around young men and boys in that very formative time of working out, who am I in the world? How do I relate to people? How do I relate to my desire? How do I relate to my sexuality, my power, my shame, all of that stuff. So it's juicy, and it's really, really urgent, I think, that we have this kind of conversation, and that we have it in a setting like today, which is all about sexual abuse and the education system, and how do those things connect, both in terms of the experience of survivors in school day to day and the kind of language and behaviour that they're exposed to, but also in terms of preventing future harm. And that is about the relationships that young men might have with others, but of course it's also about the relationships that they will form and forge with themselves. So there's quite a lot for us to think about, but you'll be glad to know that we've got some great, rich, different perspectives to help us. And the plan for the session is that we'll all kind of do a bit of talking to begin with. We'll have a bit of an exchange, and then we're really hoping to open up to you guys to ask questions or to make points, and then get some responses from that. So I can introduce myself. I'm Ali Avery. I'm part of the Survivor Voice team at the Greenhouse. So what that's about is trying to really encourage and then really lift up and amplify the voices of young survivors and also of their families, because we know that everybody's voice needs to be heard. Young people's voices particularly are often not heard, but especially young people who have often experienced feeling silenced, feeling shamed or stigma. We particularly want to lift those voices. And I guess it's maybe worth saying as well that I've also worked in the school system for quite a lot of the last sort of 20 years in mainstream and in alternative provision. So I have a particular passion for the role of schools in the lives of young people. I'm going to introduce Nathan Eisenstadt, who is a researcher at the University of Bristol, specifically looking at perpetrator interventions around domestic abuse and sexual abuse. And as well as being a researcher, he's also a practitioner. He founded Kindling Interventions, which is a gender transformative bystander intervention project. Yeah. Woo. Lewis Wedlock on the end is also with us. We're really happy today to have you. Lewis is an activist, a social psychologist, a podcaster, and also a practitioner in school. So in fact, we've worked together in a school before. Lewis coming in and delivering masculinities-based interventions with young men and boys in schools. And we've also got Rosie, who's part of the Greenhouse Voice group. And Rosie recently left school herself and is currently seeing things from the other side, working as a teaching assistant in a primary school. So maybe, Rosie, if we could start with you. You were part of raising this issue and saying this is a really important conversation to be having. Why did you think it was important?
Well, I strongly believe that schools need to start approaching these issues very differently. Schools should be providing an environment in which children feel safe, respected, and of course educated, but sadly in too many cases they fail to successfully complete any of these tasks when it comes to the topics of sexual assault, sexual health education, and healthy relationships. I recently spoke to a few of my friends from different schools, and I found many shocking and harrowing stories where the should-be trusted members of staff failed to protect students that have been affected by sexual harassment. For example, a list of girls to rape was discovered by a group of students in year 13. The school refused to take any action as they didn't believe the students because there wasn't any evidence, even though there were multiple witnesses to the creation of the list. I've heard too many stories of harassment and inappropriate touching in school going past unpunished and being gently described as banter or probably an accident. The lack of education on these issues is something that needs to change, and I felt strongly about that when the devastating story of Sarah Everard came to light, and a teacher at my sixth form who used to do assemblies on recent pieces of news refused to talk about it during one of his assemblies because apparently it wasn't a topic appropriate for school. I believe that it is crucial for all schools to provide a safe environment in which students feel they have access to the support and guidance they need, alongside the very much needed education on these topics. Without this, then I believe that the fear and shame that surrounds them will continue to grow, and in the worst case scenario, I believe that these effects may become irreversible. I suggest a change to the curriculum in sex ed that explores healthy relationships and what consent really means, alongside more specialised training for staff when they are confronted with a student that is having these issues. I believe that this may begin to influence the change that is absolutely necessary to move forward, the change that is needed right now.
Wow, there's so many strands in that, isn't there? I feel like we could pick up any one of them. But maybe coming, I guess, particularly to that thing of like the rape list and stuff in school. Maybe Lewis, we can go to you. You obviously go into schools a lot and speak with young men a lot. Like, what do you think the needs are? What are the needs that you're seeing in your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so for context, I've been doing a lot of work in schools for coming up to 4, almost 5 years. And I would say 3 of those years have been specifically working with masculinities from a range of different lived experiences. And I suppose from the social psychological lens and the lens that I kind of approach a lot of my work with, there is a need to approach masculinities, but also the behaviours that have been normalised in relation to masculinity, the apathy at times, the disconnect from responsibility, the inability to be challenged and see challenges like not as a learning route, but as a sort of route to get better and improve and understand your experience more. I think these are the sort of issues and interventions that I suppose I've been working on for the last 3 to 4 years, is understanding the issue and recognizing that the issue is multi-layered, it's multifaceted, it's linked to so many different intersecting social identities and social experiences, personal experiences, historical experiences that all blend and combine to create this masculinity that's embodied in these spaces that has a certain level of disconnection from what it means to be them, to experience themselves. And so the first step for a lot of our work is, how do we contextualize you as a masculinity in school, for example, like asking men directly, what does masculinity mean to you? And that is a question that often gets a response of, I don't know. I don't know what my masculinity means. But if you don't know what your masculinity means from a personal lens, why are you feeling a particular type of way when somebody else experiences it and tells you that they experience it a particular way, right? If you don't know what roots you in your sense of masculinity, if you don't know what roots you in your sense of embodiment, then how can we necessarily, if we don't know, then that's a process of introspection to engage with and to begin compassionately delayering and exploring. And so I think for me, the bulk of the work, because I'm often asked in the work, can you come in and solve these issues? No, I'm not an Avenger. I am not in the Justice League. I do not wear capes on the weekends. I don't do any of this stuff. I am not a fix, or practitioners are not the sole fix for a lot of this work. It is a process, and it is a process that is very tedious, it's very slow, but it's always, for me, needing to be embedded in love and compassion for the masculinity in that space. There's a lot of behaviors and a lot of framings that are, when you hear them for the first time, as was mentioned, are very difficult to hear and see and experience, and it's very difficult to deal with that on a one-to-one level. And I think when I began in this work and began doing this work, there was a sense of, how do I go about doing it? How do I go about doing it? What's the way? What's the way? What does the research say? The research didn't say jack about it. There was nothing out there at the time. So we kind of went in there very blind in many ways, because we needed to create something that felt sustainable for teachers in the space, that wasn't just reliant on, can you come in Tuesday? Can you come in Thursday? Can you come in Friday as well? Like, that's the reliance on practitioners to be able to do this work. And I think sustainability is often rooted in a slower process, but also recognizing with immediate effect the immediacy of the issues. So, I think one thing that I'm particularly passionate about in the work around working with young men and masculinity is contextualizing their experience as a process at all times, not something that's ever fixed or representative of how they should be for the rest of their lives. And in many ways sort of delayering the issues around masculinity that are often positioned as good men versus bad men. All men and all human beings can commit harm, right? So that sense of, oh, I'm good because I do this. I've been to the masculinity group. I'm a good man. Like I that's me now. I've got my badge. I can say that I'm that person. Absolutely not. All of us are able to commit harm, and all of us are, even in positions of expertise or power, are being challenged for what we frame and how we frame it. And normalizing that as a process, correction as a form of compassion, not as a form of competition, I think is something that is rooted in the work that we do. Is how do we get men to open up to that we shouldn't be doing that, or we absolutely mustn't do that, and here's why, but reflecting on that as not as a piece of evidence that alludes to inadequacy or not being enough, but as a way to root themselves in development and normalizing that process. And I think what we do in our work is we go in there and we say, I've been where you've sat. I've said or thought some of these ideas. I understand, I've worked and I've grown up with people in these spaces. I've gone through that process. I know what you're thinking, and I've been there in that space. And I was wrong at that point in my life. And in those framings, I needed to be challenged and reconnected to something else. My process was rooted in a lot of pain. My process was rooted in a lot of, inability to see challenge. And having those open conversations where young people see us not as just a practitioner that comes in to impart knowledge and leave and disappear, but as somebody that is human like them, that is open to the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, I am able to do that. That's open to the idea that this work is never finished, it's lifelong and life-wide. So what you do in school relating to masculinity with us exudes outwards into the world, into the space. And what we began to see was that through that process of intervention, the humanistic model, you would be walking through school and you would hear young lads talking to their friends saying, don't say that, we don't do that, that's not what we do, right? That's not
calling each other out.
Yeah, like, come on man, we don't do that. Or and here's the thing, it's not like you do that and you're this, it's we don't do that. I get where you're coming from or why you think that's funny, but here's why it's not. Or I know where you get that idea from, but let me tell you something I learned from like that process of conversation is a gateway to compassion and for understanding further. So I think the issues, to go back to the question, is the issues are the issues. The patriarchal system, the hegemonic masculinity that we often talk about, the intersections between misogyny and masculinity are ever present. They're across culture and time. It's not just a 21st century thing. It is present in ancient Greece. It is present in ancient Rome. It is present throughout history. It evolves, it mutates, it creates itself in the image of the societal space that it's a part of. It's not a new issue, it's just an issue that evolves with time. And so if we contextualize the experience of young people as we're evolving with systems and times, we don't need to be evolving within a system, we can evolve outside of it, and we can create something new. Understanding masculinity as a construction, not as a commitment for life, is something that gives the freedom to create and move outside of some of these harmful ideas and belief systems. So normalizing that process and normalizing that ability to always refer to yourself as an unfinished article, but an unfinished article that deserves that love and that compassion, but also can be held accountable for things that they do wrong or things that they say out of ignorance or out of unintention. Because one thing that we hear a lot in our space, going back to what was mentioned earlier on in the whole sort of space that we've been a part of, is that wasn't my intention to do that though. Like, you're bugging out. Like, I meant it this way. Like, you're taking it. That's your issue, not mine. Intention and experience are two separate things, right? If I intend not to trip you up in the corridor and you trip over my foot, apologies, I didn't mean to do that, it's not my bad. It's pretty straightforward, right? It makes sense. But all of a sudden, when it's comments or it's behaviors that we thought were like, oh, I didn't intend to do that, but it caused harm, there's a different level of power dynamics. It's a different level of, I can't be wrong. I can't say this. I can't admit to defeat. It's competition. It's not compassion. And so normalizing that process has been something that's been very valuable to see, and something that is never finished but always under construction. And so, yeah, to work with young people is to recognize that as the first component, and also, recognizing that compassion doesn't mean, pushover. A lot of people think, well, what these men need is they need hard, like, no, don't do this. Tell me a punitive measure that works. Tell me a punitive measure that works long term. Because what you do with a punitive measure is you don't stop a behavior, you stop a behavior in the context that it occurs within. So if you stop this hate crime or this sort of misogynistic behavior in school, you stopped it in school, potentially, but that happens outside of school. It happens outside of your space. So you haven't stopped a behavior, you just stopped it in the context that you're a part of. So punitive measures are often seen as the way to stop behaviors, but that is a shame-based behavior. If we want to create long-term, lasting change for the masculinities that we're working with, if you have to follow your school policy and implement punitive measures, then work alongside some restorative measures too, in their isolation. What can they learn about the experience of people that they have harmed? What have they not seen in their blind spots? How can you compassionately hold them in those spaces to acknowledge the fault of their actions, but recognize themselves as an unfinished article that's always evolving? And that opportunity to learn and to rectify their wrongs in that sense, but not in a performative way of, I'm sorry, it will never happen again. The actions are the apology. The sort of adaptation is the apology. And so that's the work that we do, and that's the importance of the work. And it has worked. We've worked with lots of local councils in and around the area. We've worked in different schools across the country. This ethos that I call the mendable ethos has really sort of engaged men in a way that they're able to see themselves as a process, not as a project or as a sort of like archetype. And I think that's the work that's, the most valuable and talks about these things that we are hearing, the scary stuff of like, why do guys think this? Why do guys believe this? Why are guys embodying this? It's because there's no alternative modeling in those spaces that can take them out of that belief system of this is the way, and it opens their mind to a multiplicity of presentations. That's why I love the masculinity stuff. There's no masculinity. They're masculinities. I have masculinities. The masculinity I was at 18 is not the masculinity I am at, coming up to 26 or 26, right? I evolve and I change. It's not the same thing. It's not fixed. So opening up that is the process, and holding that space compassionately, but also being very real in the sense of if you've done wrong, you have to be held accountable for it. You can be done so with compassion, but punitive measures alone don't solve issues. They just compound them in different contexts.
Yeah. So much again, yeah. So we'll definitely return to some of these themes. Thank you, Lewis. And then I guess, Nate, like you obviously have looked at quite broad, you've looked at a lot of different kinds of interventions like Lewis's, and I'm guessing some that are quite different. What does the research tell us? Like, what makes a difference?
So I think it's really important first to almost answer the obvious, which is why engage with traditional masculine norms, like traditional forms of masculinity. I think to most of us in the room, we look at the Andrew Tates and the Jordan Petersons and this kind of wave of backlash against progressive feminist change over the past 20 years and see the kinds of masculinity that they're promoting, and our gut feeling is this is bad. And what they're saying is that actually these forms of masculinity offer men some certainty, and maybe there's a protective factor around mental health. So, and it's not just them, there are academics who are part of this kind of backlash. So if we look at the kind of solid evidence, we know that higher conformity to traditional masculine norms, so that's things like power over women, disdain for homosexuality, emotional self-control, self-reliance, these are associated with, they correlate with higher likelihood to perpetrate, higher likelihood to believe in rape myths, so higher rape myth acceptance. We know that rape myth acceptance is higher among those that are perpetrating as well, so it provides us a really strong theoretical rationale for tackling rape myths in the interventions that we make and for tackling conformity to traditional masculine norms. We also know that something called masculine discrepancy stress is correlated with higher likelihood to perpetrate. So we know that people who conform to and embody that traditional kind of harmful hegemonic masculinity are more likely to perpetrate, but also those people who internally conform to it but feel that they don't live up to it are more likely to perpetrate. Okay? So on top of that, on top of the kind of additional risks to potential victims and survivors, we know that men who have higher adherence to traditional masculine norms are more likely to report depressive symptoms. They are less likely to seek help, and they have what's called reduced health literacy. So that's a lower ability to engage with help seeking, to engage with health professionals. They are less likely to be understood by and supported by health practitioners. So we know that there's a whole range of kind of potential harms for men who hold on to this very rigid way of being a man. So yeah, it's not just that training men in alternative kinds of masculinities seems like a good idea. It really is borne out in the evidence, and it's beneficial to people of all genders. So I guess just briefly, what is happening? So there's kind of 4 spaces of action around this. You've got your interventions, which are kind of gender transformative, so unpacking the attitudes, beliefs, ideas that we have around masculinity, femininity, the roles that we play, and trying to kind of think about and embody different ways of being a man, being a person. There's like your consent and healthy relationship stuff, so that kind of does what it says on the tin. You have bystander approaches, so that's where you're kind of mobilizing social norms, and some of the stuff that Lewis has just talked about is, you know, it's a hybrid intervention. You're doing the deconstructing masculinities, and you're encouraging positive bystander interventions and mobilizing different social norms. And then there's kind of wider campaigns, so things like Everyone's Invited, things like Me Too, which do, you know, have a real impact on the public consciousness and our ability to, and the kind of the appetite to run these kind of interventions. So what do we know works? We're actually really lucky in kind of the last decade that there have been a series of kind of rigorous randomized control trial studies, and then a set of systematic reviews. And I'm not going to go through all these different studies, but from those we can see a kind of a pattern and a kind of a set of features of things that are effective. So the kind of headline is that many of the school level interventions that were evaluated through a randomized controlled trial, so through a rigorous way of analysing their effectiveness, did manage to show changes in attitudes, beliefs, and intention to be a bystander. So we know from how I started that attitudes and beliefs that you hold are correlated with perpetration. But what has been much harder to show has been community level reductions in perpetration and victimization. So that's like a reduction in sexual violence within the school or within the university. That's been much, much harder to show. There have been a number of studies, a much smaller subset of studies that have been able to demonstrate not just changes in attitudes and beliefs, but also reductions in gender-based violence. And I'm just going to run through the features of those studies real quick. So firstly, that they're comprehensive, and I think some of the things that you mentioned about, the teachers being trained and there being stuff with students. So you need to be, it's the kind of whole school approach that we're going to hear a bit more about in the last session, that you need to be using multiple methods, that if you do some training and then you also have a poster campaign, and then you also have someone coming in and doing a talk, and you do teaching, that these things become more than the sum of their parts. So they need to be sustained. So there's a kind of dose, an importance of dose here, and it was really interesting in the last session to hear about tender being 2 days. 2 days, it's a long time. You can't do this in a 1 hour consent training. And, everybody wants the intervention to be as short as possible. Yeah, we want to save money, we want to maximise time, but there are studies which have shown that a short intervention can actually push push attitudes, beliefs and behaviours in the opposite direction. So, think about it. We're trying to undo deeply held entitlements, attitudes, beliefs, things that are deeply trained through popular culture, upbringing. We're not going to do that in an hour. And if we do that in an hour, we push people into a space of discomfort. What do we do when we feel discomfort? We seek something that's going to alleviate that discomfort. So I'm going to go home and I'm going to search for information that conforms to my pre-existing belief, and I'm probably going to be radicalised. So we could be radicalising boys through, short interventions. And if you look at the ones that actually worked, it was a minimum of 6 sessions, up to 25 sessions. So this takes time. We have to invest in it. The other thing is there does need to be a sort of compulsory dimension or a targeted dimension. It's obvious. If you just do it to the people who already care about it, then those are the people that are going to attend. So if you can be working with sports teams, if you can be working with boys specifically, the importance of skilled facilitators comes back again and again through the evaluations. You can have the best intervention on the planet, but if it's badly delivered, it's not going to do any good. And you can have a kind of bad intervention that's really well delivered, and the facilitator will do something great with it. So, and this came up in the last session, it's we need to be valuing the profound skills that the people delivering this work have and remunerating it effectively. It's really skilled, there's potential risk, there's a lot of knowledge that person needs to have, a lot of flexibility. Then the interventions need to have a gender transformative dimension. So having an intervention which is just kind of gender free, that doesn't see violence as emerging from harmful gender norms and gendered inequalities within society is less likely to be effective. And likewise, the bystander intervention there's a kind of strong evidence base for these kind of things where we're training people to practically intervene with their peers and to kind of change what's acceptable. And then finally, that it's kind of context specific, this is obvious, and this is often the case, that we do a load of research and we figure out that what we thought kind of should make sense makes sense. Not always, but it needs to be context specific, it needs to be relevant, so the examples that are used need to be able to connect with the people that you're doing it with. There's a whole kind of load of tensions with this, and maybe we could discuss that a bit more. For me, there's a tension between kind of undoing versus rebuilding masculinity. I use he, him pronouns, but I'm not that invested in my being. I benefit from male privilege, but do I want to rebuild healthy masculinity? I personally don't particularly, but some people do, and that's okay. And we kind of need to work with people where they stand. So there's this kind of undoing versus redoing tension. There's the kind of anti-violence. So is this anti-violence or is this anti-oppression? How intersectional is this work? And can we end violence within capitalism? can we end violence within white supremacy? Like, to what extent and how do we integrate these things in the interventions that we're making? You know, is this just about public health, or is it about social justice? And to what extent can we mobilise the idea of public health to do some social justice stuff, because it actually gets more people on board? There's the good versus bad men question, and then there's the kind of accountability to women's organisations and women's labour. You know, that we're in the spotlight now because we're doing some stuff with men and everyone wants to hear about that, and that's great. But and you know, that's good. And to what extent are we working with women's organisations, or bringing or working with survivors and thinking about, you know, the work that we're doing, and kind of having accountability to that. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I guess, sorry, one last piece of this is that I guess these kind of complex problems, there's this whole kind of discourse of scarcity around solving these complex problems, that we need to spend taxpayers' money as efficiently as possible. And that leads us into this kind of looking at the evidence and having to do everything kind of evidence-based. And I've kind of made an argument for being evidence-based. At the same time, there's a tension between being evidence-based and being innovative. And how are we going to innovate if we're bound to the evidence, completely bound to the evidence that has gone before? So it's kind of, what can we do that's in the spirit of what we know, but also push boundaries? So I think kind of that's our challenge.
Oh. Thank you. Well, that's a lot to get us started with, isn't it? My goodness. I feel like there are lots of themes that came up there, and in a little while I think we'll go to you guys and we can kind of pick up things that have really struck you. But I wanted to connect to some of what you said, also in relation to some of what came up. We did a kind of survey campaign at the Greenhouse. We called it More Than Surviving, where we just really wanted to invite different voices to feed into today, even if they weren't able to physically be here. And I've got some quotes that people said that I feel like connect a bit to some of what we've talked about. So actually one of them, just your point, Nate, about sort of, is it anti-violence, is it anti-oppression more generally? Something that came up in some of our voice group conversations and also in what people submitted was that schools, you know, can be quite oppressive places. And I think those of us that have worked in schools and feel like we're there because we really want to serve young people, I know I've certainly at times felt really uncomfortable with some of what I've seen in the sort of wider system, I guess, which we can call like power over, as quite normalised or even quite accepted sometimes. Like, I'm just curious about that link of like, maybe we do need to make quite explicit links about how we treat each other, not just around sexual violence, but in all kinds of power hierarchies. Discuss. Yeah, I'm just putting that out there. I don't know. Do we need more of that?
I can go, but I just spoke, so I'll...
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think, going back to what I was kind of discussing earlier on, I think there's a tendency to think, again, going back to the point around, practitioners are coming in, now we're sorted type thing. My argument over the last couple of years with schools has been, I can work with your boys as much as you want, but what are you doing as a staff force to also counteract a lot of the norms that are perpetuated in these school spaces? To go to your point, you know, there's a big myth permeating, I've seen across a range of different schools. It's not specific to one, it's not specific to Bristol, it's specific to the country, which is this idea that I see all the time of like, they're just lads, you know, it's just boys being boys, you know, it's just them, you know. What do you want me to do like about that? Is that sort of that's what they're inherently made to be like. It's a biological response or a sort of conditioned response, and that's your crux of a lot of the issues. If you're not, as a safeguarder. Let's just not put teacher in here. You're a safeguarder of children, right? Or as a practitioner in a school space, you're safeguarding. If you're not aware to the microcosms and the macrocosms and the link between, and how systems of harm are reinforced through acts and inactivity as well, like there has to be an acknowledgement that we can work with the kids all that we want, but if the behaviour that they're changing is not being accommodated, held, or rejected in the spaces that they're trying to implement behaviours in, if it's not reflected and modelled back to them within the space, there isn't going to be a shift that we're looking for in that sense, or it's going to be much more difficult to do so. And so a lot of my focus over the last couple of years has been around also working with teachers. Where do your attitudes and belief systems like sit? Like, what are your framings of masculinity, your framings of X, Y, and Z related to working with masculinities? How is that showing up, or how is that creating particular blind spots in what you are seeing and not seeing? Because we can pick up the overt stuff. Oh, that's terrible that you'd say such a misogynistic comment X, Y, and Z. But the intricacies of the comments that are made to people in class, or the normalization and the adultification of young women in school spaces that I see is just, it's rampant. But we're just like, oh, it's just part of the process, you shouldn't be, why are you wearing this, or what's going on with this? And we're doing a piece of work now with a masculinities group and a girl talk group, which is a part of Project Zazie, where the groups are coming together to speak as a mixed group to understand and link to experiences. Because going off the back of what Nate was saying, we can do isolation-based work all we want with masculinities, but there also needs to be an application to context that put those skills to the test. Like, it's safe to be in a group of men and talk about things that we're maybe feeling a bit uncomfortable or vulnerable about, but how do we do it when there's potentially perceived challenges, or that goes against the sort of systemic sort of creations and how that makes men feel? And we see all the time that these conversations are alluding to what would be quite safe conversations. You almost play into the archetype a bit more, and teachers don't respond to that. They don't call it out, they don't recognize it, they just kind of let it happen. And I think what we do in those spaces, we call it out. Man, like, when we was working together, you were like hearing this perspective and you were listening to this perspective. All of a sudden, now that this coming out and you're different group, different setting, you're abandoning those posts. Like, what's going on? Why are we trying to score points? Like, calling out the behavior and acknowledging it as it's happening, not 3 days afterwards, like, oh, remember what happened in class? No, what happened in class? I can't remember. As it's happening, when it's happening, contextualizing it and remodeling it is the way we move some of these ideas forward. But that has to happen from a teacher and staff standpoint as well. Your young people aren't the Avengers either. They're not going to come in and change your school culture because they've had 6 to 8 to 20 sessions with people like us. It's not going to happen. You've got to embody that and do that too, which also means you've got to put yourself under the microscope, which is scary. It is, stripping. It is existentially, a nightmare if you're used to doing things in a particular way. But that's the work that you have to do. You can't change a system by existing within a system and just letting other people do it. There has to be an embodiment across the space. So I think that, to go to the point, that's what we're kind of seeing in that work, and actually modelling and calling it out. And even calling up, I don't care if you're a head teacher, I don't care if you're a board of trustees, I don't care if you are SLT, I don't care if you work as a, learning support worker, I don't care who you are, what you're doing. If it's there and it's present, it's not just being called out, it's being called out in front of your people. That's how we change this stuff. And that might not be an approach for some people that they feel comfortable with, but the work has to happen from a shift. I can't just come in and gradually at times coach you in one session and say we're going to do it. It's got to be picked up, and it's got to be then compounded and then worked on and then built up, and sort of that dichotomy of, are we going to rebuild, or are we going to sort of reinvent or create? But it has to come from naming stuff. We can't just pretend that it doesn't happen. We can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. But a lot of people are afraid to do that, and I see the fear. I can't say that's going to ruin his career if I make that point, or how's that going to show up in SLT meeting if I've just called it SLT for behaviours. Like, that power shift and that dichotomy is really interesting to see, but stuff that we're doing and actively attempting to deconstruct in our work. So yeah.
And I guess that connects, I think, to some of what you were saying, Nate, about like the most effective change kind of happens on lots of fronts at the same time. Because I know you said young people aren't Avengers, but some of what you were saying, Rosie, did sound kind of like being, really great on it young people who were like, we need to have this conversation in assembly, we want to call out this behaviour, and yet it sounds like the sort of adults that you needed alongside supporting that really weren't able to show up and do that.
I think, I feel like because there isn't the training, like you said, it's sometimes an intervention where someone exterior, like someone outside the school comes in to do it, then a teacher will further feel like it's not their responsibility because they know they've planned someone else to come in and talk about it, which I think it's great that people do come in and do the talks, they're so important, but it leaves the school without the responsibility of it. And 100%. I do think that it's something awkward for teachers to talk about, and students know that, and I feel like I would feel more comfortable speaking to either of you about an issue in school, knowing that that's your job, than a teacher that I might have known for several years, just because it's not a space where there is an open conversation about it. It's condensed into these specific days where an outsider comes in. So I think it does need to be more of an open conversation, and it shouldn't be such a big deal for people like you to come in, and it shouldn't be like an abnormal thing. It should be something that's immersed within school culture that everybody experiences, and throughout the whole year, not just like a few sessions, definitely.
100%. Just off the back of that, we often get asked to come in to talk about toxic masculinity is the thing, like that we'll get now is and have been for the last sort of 18 months, building on from that point, which is like, we need you to come in to talk about toxic masculinity, and it's like, cool, but think about what you've just asked me to do, right? You want me to come in to your school and say, right, guys, what's going on? Yeah? Like, what's wrong with you? Yeah? Like, what we doing? That, as I've mentioned before, doesn't particularly work, because all of a sudden it's like, who's that? Like, who's it? Who's this guy you just brought in? I don't know who he is. And it creates this weird thing of like, what are we actually doing? And the one thing I say to young people is, toxicity isn't a like suit. It's a list of behaviors and ideas that we pull and we just attach to ourselves. Beliefs and behaviors can be reworked, they can be redesigned, they can be recreated. But coming into a school to talk about toxic masculinity reduces the conversation to toxic masculinity and doesn't broaden the scope to be like, these things definitely need work, but also, what about this stuff over here that we can make more of an effort to channel into? What does it look like outside of masculinity? Because I'm tired of talking about masculinity from the lens of just masculinity. Like, the best and most valuable work around what it means to embody my identity didn't come from speaking with just masculinities. It came from working and speaking with different gendered experiences that helped me to understand the construction of identity. This idea that I'm not just a canvas that is painted onto, I am the canvas, the paintbrush, the paint, all at the same time, crafting and creating my experience. The freedom with that is liberating. But a lot of the men that we work with, or schools, want us to talk about it from such a lens of, let's talk about toxic masculinity. You're talking about a very specific subset of behaviours that definitely need to be worked on and acknowledged and contextualised, but that shouldn't be the only contact for masculinity that these young men are experiencing in the school space. It should be broadened up. If we're going to do something toxic masculinity related or toxic related, give us 8 to 12 sessions to build not just within that, but across the space, across the field in that sense. And so, yeah, it really sort of acknowledged a frustration that I've got in the school space. It's a quick fix. Get us, what's hot now, Andrew Tate? Right, who do you know that does masculinity work? Okay, cool, can they come in? They want to be paid for it. Oh, okay. So like, put your money where your mouth is, or recognize the length of the work that needs to be had alongside the work. Just to really make that point super clear, like, it's not something that we'll do in an assembly. It's not something that we'll do in a guest workshop. We have to be there for the long term, and you have to be under the impression that we should be disposed of at some point. Okay, we've had enough, we can do this now. We can implement this on our own. Like, not that sort of like holding me here and being like, we can't let you go. So we need you to still be here type thing. So just to build on that point, because I think it's really important.
I think this kind of approach to masculinity, or to this kind of idea around this approach to toxic masculinity, it's reflective of a punitive and hierarchical approach to organising society, organising school. And I think it comes back to this question of like, how far does this go? So it's like, if we're teaching consent, what does consent look like in an organisation? How is that reflected in the way that we make decisions? How are we doing consent in all of our relationships? And I think if boys are taught that the system is hierarchical, and if you deviate, you're punished, well, of course, that's going to be reflected in how they relate to each other and how they relate to their intimate partners. So we're absolutely kidding ourselves if we think we can just be like, this bit is wrong.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece of this is we need to think about like why boys and young men are drawn towards these kind of influences, and what do these kind of influences offer? They offer certainty in a world where their identity feels quite uncertain, and we're told that it's not okay to be uncertain. You know, that if certainty is king, we've trained them that certainty and knowing, you know, being in charge, being at the top of the hierarchy is king. Well, of course, when someone comes along who offers them exactly that, they're going to be drawn into it. They offer them non-shame. So whereas like the toxic masculinity discourse is saying, you know, you're doing being a person wrong and you should be ashamed of it, these people are coming along and saying you've got nothing to be ashamed of. So it's that kind of, and in addition to that, it's power. It's like you don't have to engage with that discomfort. So I think it's how do we enable young people identifying as boys, as men and boys, to be okay with that discomfort of being in discomfort is part of being a person.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like we're kidding ourselves if we can ever get away from that. But it's like, I think it's more around training to sit with that than and saying actually, yeah, what Andrew Tate or what 60%, whatever percent of what they say is like, if you start looking at their stuff and you try and pull out some like really horrendous quotes, you can do it, but you'll have to wade through a huge amount of stuff first that is basic common sense. So if you say to a young person, like 100% of what this person says, 60% of which is actually common sense, is wrong, then they're confused. It's like saying, you know, all drugs are the same, all drugs are equally bad. That young person is not equipped to go and navigate what drugs are available to them if they're told that all drugs are bad. And it's the same with this. It's like, if they're told that this person's evil and everything they say is completely wrong, when they say some basic common sense, some basic lifestyle common sense advice that is true, or that has a kernel of truth to it, they're going to feel that the adult or the people that are telling them it's wrong aren't trustworthy. So we need to have a more nuanced engagement with what these people are saying.
100%.
That's such an important point, isn't it? How easy it would be I know I've been a safeguarding lead in a school, you know, to be like, oh, you know, I can't believe you wrote that on your homework to your female teacher or something, and then it's like really polarising of which adults am I trusting, essentially, like you say. I wanted to come, just you talking about uncertainty, and you spoke, Lewis, about challenge and like almost like the practice of being able to experience challenge. And I want to link it to consent, actually, because my sense is that when we teach consent, when we speak about consent, what we don't always acknowledge is also the place of shame, and that if we're genuinely trying to create a world where all of us can say yes and can say no and can change our minds and it's fluid, what that involves essentially are moments of rejection, right? And experiencing moments of rejection. I was talking to a friend prepping for this who was like, but the no is so much part of the yes. Like the no makes all of the yes really good, like in a relationship, say. But I'm really curious about young men who, you know, the availability of porn is obviously absolutely enormous. I feel like maybe we haven't acknowledged that yet. I've read some stats. The average age that young people first see pornography is 13. 10% will have seen it by 9 years old, 27% by 11 years old. and 79% of young people before 18 will have encountered violent porn. So huge amounts of kind of intake as people are sort of building their sense of what sexuality is, what normal sexuality looks like, and forming their desire. And yet we're saying there are moments where it's really important that you stop, and you're going to feel rejected in the midst of that. And I want to raise that as to me that feels like it's missing in the conversations.
Yeah, we do a session on, like, well, when I used to facilitate, our team still does sessions on human relationships, consent across the sort of human relationship spectrum. And yeah, you're right, you know, when it comes to romantic relationships, it's the elephant in the room. It's like, where'd you get some of these ideas about what it means to be in a relationship? Everyone's like, I don't know. It's like, you do know, like, what stuff? Music, media, cool. Anything else? Books, cool. Anything else? I'm not gonna say it, like, but that sense of like, well, yeah, it gives you a sense of, I think the thing and how we approach it is, it's often the first time sexuality is presented to masculinities or people by watching this. So it's kind of like, oh, that's what it's like then? Okay, cool. Or, okay, that's become normalized, it's desensitized, it's this expectation, it's a performance. Everything happens this way and this is what we need to do. And the idea of messiness, which is part of the human experience of like, nah, I'm not quite, that's just not part of these productions or whatever it is. And the production element is fed into this idea of sexuality and sexual expression being performance based. And we have a lot of conversations with our young men around this idea of like, this isn't a performance, this is you're with another person, like what's that process looking like, and what things is actually gonna happen, what things do you need to be prepared for, and what does that say? It doesn't say I'm not a man because I didn't X, Y, and Z. It's more like, oh, my masculinity in that space, I embodied something that was, you know, healthy, or quote unquote healthy in that sense of recognizing it. It's not just rejection, it's making sure my person that I'm with feels safe and safety. And that's like an act of love, not just an act of like, not like I'm in love with somebody, but love being something that comes out to all people that we engage with. Love not just being sexualized love, but care of like, hey, okay, that's fine, no problem. That idea is so removed from the context of sexual activity online and what we're seeing in other forms of mass media, that is almost like oh, that makes kind of sense, and I feel a lot less pressurized about this now. If this doesn't happen, or if something does come up, it doesn't reflect on my masculinity, it's just what kind of happens. This is normal, like that sense of relief around the humanity aspect of it, I think is important. And again, schools don't touch the surface of that. It's not even remotely in the conversation. Consent is so one directional, and you know, this is what it is. 5-minute video, all right, back to the next lesson, you know, like that sense of here we go, you know. But consent work is it should be embodied and embedded throughout the whole entirety of school. Not just sexualized consent, but consent of like, hey, are you cool for me to like rest my hand on your shoulder when I'm chatting to you or something like this? I see it all the time in like playgrounds. Like you got someone talking and they're like, and the person's a bit like, what are you doing? Like it's not super uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable enough to be like, take your hands off me. Like you're in my personal space. But that bleeds into what we're talking about as well. Recognizing the body as a crosser of space and interpersonal spaces, and actually recognizing it as something that can cause uncomfortableness and uncomfortableness. This stuff isn't remotely talked about in school spaces, and so I think it leads into everything that we've discussed and the importance around it. But again, the questions that often come up, and I'm going to sound like a hater when I say this because I'm saying it a lot, the questions or the remarks are always like, well, but we haven't got funding pots for this, or it's something that, how quickly can we get it done, or can you do it in an afternoon? It's like, no, because it has to be embedded across a journey. English, maths and science, there's a trajectory for it. We're going to take you here, then we're going to move you there, da, da, da. School is a microcosm of society, and if a society that isn't aware of consent and isn't understanding of it and of its importance, then of course it's going to be reflected in that school culture as well, but the microcosm can shape the macrocosm. What we do in here can shape what happens out here. It can have that lasting impact as well. So I think, again, you're right, it's not mentioned enough, but it's something that needs to be embedded a lot more, because it's becoming more and more pressing. You hear more and more about situations in schools that are increasingly becoming more and more dangerous, increasingly becoming more and more, not held or engaged. It's the elephant in the room, and schools aren't prepared, they aren't equipped, and they aren't willing to engage in that work as it should be done, because it says something about them. We haven't thought about this, and so we're just didn't happen. But the consequences, there are young people that leave school, that should have enjoyed school, that remembered not what they learned in school, but how they were treated in school, and how their experiences were gaslighted, passed off, not contextualized. And I have a personal problem with that, and I know as a panel and as a space we do as well. But we can say this all that we want. It has to be matched in the work that's happening too. So yeah, sorry, I went off on a...
No, it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree I feel quite strongly about how consent is taught in schools. I really hate the tea video. I really hate it, and I think everyone my age will have seen it. Like, they stick it on once a year, and it's so normal, like everyone's seen it, and that's how they teach consent. And it just blows my mind that we all sat there, like, normally watching it, and they're comparing rape to a cup of tea, and it's ridiculous. It doesn't show the severity at all. It doesn't show the consequences. It doesn't show any of the emotional side. It just compares it to a cup of tea, and it's just the most British, silent, awkward video, and it's so inaccurate, and it's just painful, because I know that, well, I have a family member who is a teacher, and it was his first time watching this video, and he was like, it's great, it's so simple, it breaks it down. But I think that's what's incredibly wrong with it, and it's just not taught enough. And like, even if it is explained in the correct language of assault or rape, it still wouldn't explain how intricate consent can be. And I mean, I think it was only like the last year or so that I found out that coercion is a form of sexual assault. I had no idea, because I didn't realise that just because you've said yes after like a series of no, it doesn't mean consent. And that's not taught. None of this is ever taught. And yeah, that's something that I feel really strongly about, and I hope there's change to it. Especially like, because I work in a primary school now, and it's so important for children to learn no, and to learn that if somebody says no, then you take that seriously. And, I try and push that where I can, but it has to be on a wider scale. It has to be, and yeah.
Did you want to add to
Yeah,
that,
I mean, I think the tea video is a really interesting one, and hearing you talk about it, I wonder if it's almost like a set of dog whistles to adults who already understand all these things. So when we who are immersed in it watch this, we get all these signals of like, yeah, but it's actually not connecting. It's clearly not enough on its own. But just because it encapsulates a load of things to people who already have thought about those things, it doesn't mean that it can tell those things to people who haven't. And I guess another question that I have around the video is to what extent and we're talking about this as if everyone has seen it, and I'm assuming that everyone in this room has, but even if not, I guess another potential challenge with it is that it positions women as the gatekeepers of sex.
Yeah.
And there's two problems with that. So, it's like, we've got to do consent training with boys so you can get consent. And so suddenly, like, consent is this thing that... So what are the implicit claims there? The implicit claim is that boys always want sex, therefore they can't say no, therefore consent doesn't apply to them the other way, and that women are the gatekeepers. What's the implication if women are the gatekeepers? Well, if consent goes wrong, if some kind of sexual coercion does take place, then it's her fault because she was the gatekeeper, she wasn't managing the gate properly. So it's, I guess it's like, how do we have that much more nuanced conversation? We've been doing some stuff in the Premier League with a couple of football clubs recently, and this idea about, and so with players, with the board, with the coaches, and this idea that like men could also consent was like a really radical idea. You know, that it was like a real light bulb moment at one point.
And that is so important to name, isn't it? I guess also in the context of the stats we heard first thing of like every classroom in every school will have children sitting in it who have been or are being sexually abused. The importance of including that experience, right? And not just sort of these broad brush, like you say, men or, just lots there, lots and lots there. I'm aware that we're into our last 15 minutes and I really want to give an opportunity for anyone, I've got loads more questions in my mind, so we'll see how we go, but if there are people in the audience who really want to offer some questions or some comments, please do. Are you okay to bring the microphone to this person here? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering, do you think it's a lot to maybe put on teachers to be the ones to like address these kind of toxic masculinity or consent issues? Or do you think maybe like the role of a teacher is changing to incorporate kind of more psychological and social care elements? Like my housemate is a secondary school teacher, and I was telling her about the talks going on today, and she was really interested in them, but obviously like couldn't attend because she's teaching right now, so it's just like not very accessible to teachers. But I mean, I think even if it was accessible, like she has a lot on her plate already, and I don't know. I just don't know how open she would, how much she would be able to take that on.
It's a great question. Do you mind if I take this one first? Is that all right? Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of pieces of work that I'm personally involved in around the sort of whole school approach, which isn't, because my thing is, teachers aren't teachers, they're safeguarders, they're emotional support. I absolutely 100% agree with that. And so it's that process of recognizing, kind of going back to what we were saying earlier on, that the work isn't necessarily, it's not revolving around specific teachers doing specific work. Instead, it's a cultural shift that happens during processes of conversation, of reflections, of introspections that then can formulate an ethos or reformulate an ethos that then gets tried to rework into the school structure. I can't say with confidence how it's going to go because I'm still doing it at the moment. I'm in the very early stages of it, so you might come back, you might see me, but how did it go? But that's the ethos of it, in the sense of like how you're right. And elephant in the room as well, like teachers, for what they do and how they hold it, they're not paid in accordance to what they do and how well they do it for the most part as well, and recognizing that too. So how do you embody and rework an ethos first and then coach them through that process? Maybe that's a bit more of a sort of outside person coming in type work. But you're right, that is also the questions that we get. It's like, sounds great on paper, Lewis, but I've got 30 students to work with, 6 times a day. I don't have time, plus meetings and SLT stuff. So it's about also recognizing, okay, where does that shift into the wider sort of school structure to allow this type of work to happen? If it's valuable, then time should be made for it, but not at the expense of maybe other work, but recognizing, okay, when can this work be done? Can't be done over a couple of weeks, but it can be done through a process and a work that we're committing to in slow bursts, but intentional bursts that don't kind of just hyperfix, but focus on the sort of building up of that work. So I'll let you know how that goes from my perspective, but I don't know if anyone else has any sort of points to add to that.
I mean, one thought I had was also just, obviously, teachers can also be survivors themselves. Yep. Teachers will have their own emotional experience. We know there's, massive stress, isn't there, massive burnout in the teaching workforce, and obviously, we are all entitled to feel safe at work, and that includes teachers. So I guess it's for me, it's sort of something about building the confidence and the sense of like, what is my role here? Is it teaching biology? Is it serving these young people who were in my care period 3 and 5 every whatever, while acknowledging that they also need a team around them, and both training but also, like we've talked before about sort of sustainability and kind of ongoing support, because it's distressing, right, some of these trends that we're seeing, and I think there's a lot more reports now about sexual violence against teachers, sexual harassment and aggression against teachers, is very real and needs like really active action, not just sort of thinking that's part of the role of being a teacher, Did either of you want to add anything else?
I mean, briefly, I think both. I think there's a role for respected mentors, as in like people coming in from outside because they're able to have conversations that it can be really challenging for teachers to have, and there needs to be the training and the systems in place with the caveats that you mentioned around they may be survivors, so they don't have to do it, but some teachers in the school are equipped. So I think it's an and.
Thank you. I don't know where to go next. Maybe here. There was 2 more here at the front.
I've had a couple of thoughts going around in my head. One is, I'm come from Nottinghamshire, and we have been doing some work with a school where the group of boys who were feeling quite alienated in school and were getting into trouble all the time, and they targeted a help team, came in and did some work with them, and they all talked about their own experiences of domestic abuse, and often repeated perpetrators of abuse coming into their families. And then driving down today, there was something on the news about 5 boys who've been arrested for the sexual assault of a girl in Nottinghamshire. And I was thinking there about that sense of belonging, and whether that's, it's kind of that, for me that just feels such a shocking thing that those boys come together, but whether there is something about that need for a sense of belonging that school doesn't provide them, because once they start getting into trouble, then they feel very alienated, they don't have a sense of belonging in the school, and just wondered, kind of interested how that fits for the experience of the panel.
So hugely important to say that many young people, many boys who experience domestic abuse at home won't go on to perpetrate, but certainly in the work that we do with perpetrators of domestic abuse, both in research and as a practitioner, men who've experienced domestic abuse at home, those behaviours have been trained, are massively disproportionately represented in that group. And I think, for me, it's about, we need a whole school approach, we need a whole society approach, and we need to be doing non-punitive, transformative justice. There needs to be good evidence and interventions around perpetrators, so that it isn't repeating the cycle. I know that's kind of an easy answer, but I guess yes, it's something that we see. I think one of the things that has started to happen with perpetrator interventions has been more kind of cost-benefit analyses, so making the case that a non-punitive, transformative approach actually costs less to society because of the huge cost of children going into care, the cost of the NHS, the various associated costs of domestic abuse. And as we were having this conversation, I was thinking, and I haven't seen this myself, it might be in there, please let me know, and I'm going to look for it after this, about a kind of cost-benefit analysis of a gender-based violence prevention program in a school for the kind of educational outcomes for those people. So we know that it can be really damaging to a person's education if they experience sexual violence at school or at home. So this whole thing about, we don't have the money to bring these people in to do this thing, it's like, actually, if our goal is to give people the best education, even for the less money, there may be an economic argument for spending a lot of money on ending sexual violence in schools for better education. So I guess, that's something I want to look more into on the basis of this conversation.
Making the case in the hard language that politicians might hear. Yeah, belonging is a huge... Yeah, I'm really glad you said that word, and I think that connects to some of what you said about like the certainties in some of that kind of manosphere online world of like your Jordan Peterson, you know, is like make your bed, stand up straight, like really good, useful, important reminders. And then it's something about, well, what is it all about good, solid, belonging stuff, or are there actually really harmful parts alongside? Yeah. Should we hear another question? Maybe you at the second row, yeah.
Just a very quick one. So it was mentioned earlier on that the unspoken thing is the majority, I suppose, of the people doing the labour and the work to tackle sexual abuse is women. How can we make a career in violence prevention an attractive one for men and boys? Because I think that's having role models like yourself in front of groups of young boys is really important. But how do we find or make that an attractive career option for young men?
It's a great question. I have a saying that I would say to young people that I work with is like, a lot of this work is kind of, once you know what we're talking about, it's very difficult not to see it in that sense. And that's not a bad thing. It's not like you should be like, okay, I don't want to touch this or go into that anymore. But recognizing that what we do or how we do it, or the ways in which we do it, there are several ways to enter the work that you've just described. It doesn't need to be this forward-facing stuff. It doesn't need to be podcast. It doesn't need to be in a place where there's gratification, but the gratification itself is in the service, and that is remodeling a lot of the work of like to young people. Is that we don't. I'm saying confidently, if I'm speaking on behalf, please correct. But this stuff is cool because we get to talk to people that I love and respect and admire massively. But it's not why I do the work, and showing that to young people is like, this doesn't need to be something that you get rewarded for. It's something that you have to do from your heart, in that position of like that love for helping and serving others, or bringing that work into spaces, and showing them the pathways to that. You know, a lot of the young people that I've worked with have gone on to study psychology or some of the social sciences, criminology, and gone into their various sectors with their own particular lived experience, shaping those spaces with what they've learned from the spaces that we've been a part of, but most importantly and more pertinently, piecing together what they've learned at uni or wherever they've gone to train and put it into their own approach, and actually saying you can craft the work that you want to do in service to others in that sense. That's how you make it more attractive. I'm not trained to do this a particular way. I've created a way, and I've listened, and I've been there, and I've done it. And that's what's the most enjoyable aspect of it. Every day I go to work, I'm like, what can I learn and relearn today? And making that an attractive proposition is something that, you know, particularly the young people that I've historically worked with, myself, young people racialized as black and brown predominantly, you've got people entering the sector that can offer that unique experience from their lived seat that shapes and contacts and works with young people that are historically underrepresented or misrepresented in those sectors and space. That's personally how I would like to do it. Yeah.
Nate, do you want? I know we're just going to finish, but do you want to just add anything to that?
So I guess, yeah, like we're hugely lucky that we get to do something which is meaningful, that we get paid, and that people think we're a nice person because of the thing that we do. It's like, it's absolutely ridiculous. You know, it's a huge privilege, and it's a feature of the unequal gender order, and I'm accruing like authority and benefit from even saying this. Yeah. So it's kind of something that you can't really escape. So there's two paths. One is that we kind of reshape like aspirations that young men and boys seek, a kind of values-based fulfilling life is one way. The other way is that it's better paid. You know, like working in the gender-based violence prevention and response like sector is ridiculously underpaid because it's feminized labor. And so, you know, these two things are incompatible in a way, but, you know, that's the other thing. If we care about this, as a society, let's invest in it and pay people properly. And unfortunately, that will attract more men.
Great. Thank you all so much for being part of the conversation. Thank you, Lewis, Nate and Rosie. And thank you also, Martina, for that great comedy sketch at the beginning.